Hello, and welcome to my channel. My name is Jonathan Cohn, and today I'll be providing my review of Chuck Wendig's spy thriller novel, Zeros. This is a standalone novel by Chuck Wendig about a bunch of hackers who are all assembled by the US government, seemingly for one purpose, but secretly for another purpose. And so I've actually been eyeing this book for a while, and I picked it up, and I have very, very mixed thoughts. The basic rundown of the book is I thought part 1 was a 3 out of 5. I thought that parts 2 and 3 were 1 out of 5. And then I thought parts 4 through 7 were 3.5 stars out of 5. And so that's a complicated way of saying I thought the beginning was okay. I really did not like the middle. And then the middle turning into the end was actually quite entertaining. And so I'll get into my more full thoughts down below. But if you've read this novel, let me know in the comments section. If you've read anything by Chuck Wendig, let me know that as well. This is not the first Chuck Wendig novel I've actually read. So the first books of his I read, like a lot of people, is his Star Wars books. He wrote Aftermath, he wrote Life Debt, and then he wrote Empire's End. I actually quite enjoyed the entire trilogy. Particularly, I really liked Aftermath. I know a lot of people didn't like this trilogy, and I completely understand the reasoning. For a lot of people, he wrote Star Wars, not what they were looking for. It was not the type of story, not the type of style, all that stuff. But I've always felt that Star Wars needs to do two things. It needs to keep a certain level of feeling while at the same time branching out. And some authors have done a good job of keeping the feeling the same, but haven't really branched out in their storytelling. And some authors have really branched out a lot, but they didn't keep the same Star Wars-y feeling. Whereas Chuck Wendig, I think, hit that balance. This feels like a Star Wars trilogy. At the same time, it feels very different. It feels like a Chuck Wendig trilogy. So I highly enjoyed it. I gave all of them 3.5 or 4 out of 5 stars. Like, quite good. Then I also read his book, Invasive, which is a killer ant novel and is technically a follow-up to Zeros, and I'll get into that a little bit more later. But I read this book because it was a used book at a used bookstore, and it looked like an interesting premise. It looked like Jurassic Park, but with ants. And so I picked up this book, and it was fun. I had a lot of problems with it, but it was a fun book. I gave it 6 out of 10 is the rating I'd give this one. So I think that this was a fun book, and I saw that it was technically part of a series. I'm using air quotes there, technically part of a series. And Zeros was the first book, so I thought, I'll give Zeros a chance. And there's a lot that Chuck Wendig gets right in this book, and there's a lot that he gets wrong in this book. So why don't I go through all of my thoughts in my review, but what the first thing I can characterize this is the Chuck Wendigiest of Chuck Wendig books, by far. I want to praise the beginning because it did a good job of establishing all of the characters. There are 5 hackers here, and they all have, despite all being hackers, they all have very different personalities. You know, Alina is very different from Reagan, and Reagan is very different from Chance, and who's very different from DeAndre, who's very different from the other characters. So there's a lot of characters established, but they all have unique aspects, unique characteristics that work for them. However, at times, it can feel like the author is resorting to stereotypes, whether it's racial stereotypes, religious stereotypes, sexual stereotypes. He kind of resorts to stereotypes at times, and it actually works because the characters all feel very different, but at the same time you feel like he's stepping a little bit too much to the edge of being racist at times or sexist or something. And so it's a very weird, some people may really like this, some people really won't. But at least what I can say is the characters all felt very different at the beginning. The middle, the parts 2 and 3 is where the book really fell apart for me. As soon as they got to the lodge, I had trouble understanding what their purpose even was. I had trouble following what the plot was because it was all them on computers messing each other up. And then also it it didn't feel propulsive at all until there's something at the end of part 3 that sets the story on a completely different journey. And that's when they leave the lodge. And from when they get to the lodge to when they leave the lodge, I just could not have cared less about the story, and I was just so frustrated with it. But then we have part 4, which sets it on its journey towards the end, which I thought was actually quite more easy to understand and a much more enjoyable story. It changes directions hard, but in a direction that I really liked. I thought the ending was really well paced, well thought out. I thought the action was good. Chuck Wendig does a good job intercutting scenes here from one character to another character. He does a good intercutting, a way a good novelist should. And it reminded me, the ending in particular, reminded me of a cross between Eagle Eye and a James Bond movie, specifically featuring the character of Q. If you combine those two together, you get this type of a book. And so I thought the ending is what saved the book and really made it worthwhile in the end. Of all the characters in the book, there are 2 in particular that I thought were well written. You have Hollis Cooper, who is the federal agent whose basically job is to wrangle all the hackers, and then one of the hackers, Chance Dalton. He was the most likable to me, while literally everyone else got on my nerves. I couldn't stand anyone else. I thought I was frustrated with the way they were written. I was frustrated with the decisions they were making, the lines of dialogue they had, and other stuff. And so Chuck Wendig has this habit of putting together a team of characters who are dysfunctional but have some kind of likable quality, and putting them together, and when they work in unison, they're better together than they could be apart, and they're actually a group of lovable misfits. The problem is, he has the group of misfits, but they're not really lovable in this book. His group, I think, in Invasive works together. It's a smaller group, but it works together. And then his group in Aftermath, the trilogy, is pretty lovable, I think, and works well. But they just aren't lovable here, except for Chance and Hollis. So that was part of my problem. Another big problem that I have with this book, that I have with all of Chuck Wendig's books, but is most exacerbated here, is Chuck Wendig's worldviews. They bleed into his books more than any other fiction writer I've ever read. You know, a lot of fiction writers, you can see where they're coming from, you can understand their political worldview, you can stand their religious worldview, their social worldview, things like that. You can understand them, but you don't feel like you're being hit over the head with it. And Chuck Wendig, sometimes, at times, his other books feel like this, but it's not throughout the whole book. This book, the whole book, I feel like I was getting hit over the head with worldview stuff. And I just don't like that feeling in my books, particularly when I feel like I'm on the attacked side. And part of the issue I had is that he does not write Christians well. And I like to caveat this by saying, you don't have to be a Christian to write Christian characters well. I think that Jim Butcher, he wrote the book Grave Peril that I really liked. I thought that was the best of the Dresden Files books that I've read so far. I've read the first 4. And that book worked for me because the character of Michael Carpenter, who is a Christian character, just was nailed. He absolutely got that character right. And it was refreshing to see that in fiction. And here, the characters, any of the Christian, there's not too many Christian characters in here, and they're not too prevalent. But when they are on the screen, he just doesn't understand how Christian characters talk or act or anything. And it makes me wonder if Wendig had a unfortunate instance where he had a bad run-in with a bad Christian, because it just doesn't seem natural to me. It was very frustrating in that sense. And I'm okay with Wendig having a different opinion than me on Christianity and on religious characters. That's totally fine, but because he just bashes you over the head with his worldview, it's just frustrating. It's just a tough read. It makes it to the point that if you don't agree with Wendig on everything, then you're not going to like reading the book because you're going to feel preached at. That's just how it feels. There's also other elements that are very frustrating in the book, such as there's some sexual elements, there's some crude humor, and there's some language. The language in particular is the biggest offender in this book. There are F-bombs and there are other horrible language words used throughout the book. It is incessant, and it was unnecessary, and it just felt rough to read. I was, every time I read them, I cringed because he couldn't come up with a better word, and also people don't use that much language when talking in real life. It was just frustrating. And so when you combine all those elements together, it makes it very hard to read the book. This book was written before the book Invasive, and they are apparently connected. I read both books. I read them out of order. I read Invasive and then read Zeros. And if I hadn't known that they were connected, I would never have guessed. Because the only connection that I could figure out was the character of Hollis Cooper, who is in both books. But I don't really remember him much in Invasive. And I remember him in Zeros, but I don't remember him in Invasive, so it doesn't really connect all that much. And really, it doesn't need to, because they're very much standalone style stories. One is about hackers, one is about killer ants. This is a big cast of characters. This has pretty much one central character with a few other minor characters behind them. So it's they're very different books, so you can read Invasive without reading Zeros, and vice versa. And in fact, I would recommend Invasive. I'm not sure I can recommend Zeros, even though I will say at the end it was really entertaining. The ending was entertaining. I will give it that. I might just be my fuzzy memory. Maybe there are other connections that other people will point out that I just missed, and if you know them, put them down in the comments, but I just didn't remember any of the connections. There are sometimes, I will say, that Chuck Wendig's humor does work. He can be very morbid at times, and sometimes it really works for me. And there were legitimately moments that did make me laugh out loud. But there were other times that his humor made me cringe and made me feel uncomfortable, and I don't like that type of humor necessarily. But what I do like is Chuck Wendig has a very distinct style, and even though it's not my favorite style, it feels refreshing to go into a totally different style. Sometimes when you read a bunch of epic fantasies or sci-fis, it starts getting bland because they all start to mesh together, but nothing about Chuck Wendig is bland because he's just totally different than anyone else. So that's why, even though he's not my favorite, it's refreshing to read a book like this because of the style. So overall, I think the book quality is okay, but it's all over the place. There are good elements, great elements, and horrible elements, but I would give the book a 5.4 out of 10. Of the 5 Chuck Wendig books I've read, the Aftermath trilogy, and Invasive, and Zeros. Zeros is the worst of them, but it is not a bad book. I would give it a 5.4. It's just on the side of being a positive review, of being a good book, but it's not terrific at all. So those are my thoughts on Zeros. If you've read this book, let me know your thoughts and comments down below. If you haven't read this book but have read other Chuck Wendig books that you want to recommend to me, let me know that in the comments below. And until next time, I'm Jonathan, and thank you for watching.